Hello and welcome to this Constitution Unit seminar. I'm Alan Renwick, Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit, and I'm your chair for the seminar in which we're talking about the regulation of party funding. This issue, as many of you will be aware, rocketed up the agenda around Christmas time amidst rumours that Elon Musk might give $100 million to one of the UK's political parties, an amount that would dwarf all previous donations. So the government is committed to clamping down on money coming into the system from abroad, where it's widely accepted the current arrangements have weak points. But there are big questions about whether it should go further than that, perhaps by introducing a cap on the amount that anyone can donate to political parties. So we have various questions to explore over the next hour and a bit. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the UK's current party funding regulations? Are they sufficiently robust, fair and transparent? And if not, how might they be improved? To explore these matters, we're joined by a fantastic panel. Jackie Killeen is Director of Electoral Administration and Regulation at the Electoral Commission. Dr. Jess Garland is Director of Research and Policy for the Electoral Reform Society. Lord Pack of Crouch Hill, who is much better known to all of us as Mark Pack, is President of the Liberal Democrats. And Professor Justin Fisher is Professor of Political Science at Brunel University of London and an expert on party finance in the UK. So welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Our plan for the day is that each of the speakers will make opening remarks, after which we'll have some discussion on the panel, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. Questions will be gathered by Tom Fleming, whom you can also see on your screen. So if you have a question that you'd like to put to the panel, please write it in the Q&A function here on Zoom. Tom will then collect a broad range of questions and read them out. If you'd like to ask a question anonymously, you can indicate that when you submit your question. And just finally, before I hand over to our first speaker, I should also just note that the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the Constitution Unit website, our YouTube channel, and our podcast after the event. And you might want to take that into account when deciding whether to ask your question anonymously or not. So that is enough from me. I will hand straight over to our first speaker, who is Jackie Killeen. Jackie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you, colleagues at the Constitution Unit, for the invitation to participate in today's seminar. I'm looking forward to hearing from fellow panelists and audience members too. I'll give a brief overview of the current political finance system and the Electoral Commission's role in it, and share some data on levels of public confidence in it, as well as some reflections on how the system might be strengthened. So, first of all, about the Commission and the current political finance rules. Our starting point is that it's hugely important that voters can trust the financing of our political system and that they feel it's transparent. And the Commission plays a critical role in delivering this. We publish key financial data on a regular basis to provide voters with transparency over the money spent by and received by candidates, parties and campaigners. And we also support all of those candidates, parties and campaigners to understand and to follow the rules. This is to reduce the risk that they accidentally break them and to make sure that the rules are not a barrier to smaller parties or to independents. And then where there are breaches, we consider and investigate them under our enforcement powers, and where necessary, we take action. So that is our sort of end-to-end model. The political finance regime that we enforce and that we support campaigners to comply with was introduced 25 years ago. So it's the 25th anniversary of what we know as PPERA. Political finance rules for parties were introduced via the Political Parties, Elections and Referendums Act of 2000 by Parliament, building on existing rules for candidates, which were set out in the Representation of the People's Act in 1983. And that same legislation set up the Electoral Commission as the regulator that oversees elections and regulates political finance. I think the legislation at the time reflected growing public concern about the accelerating costs of elections and the pressure among the main parties to match or even outspend each other, as well as concerns about foreign money being used to influence UK elections. And the proposed laws, as you've mentioned, Alan, were based on the principles of fairness, transparency, and integrity. So the current rules cover two broad areas: who parties and campaigners can accept donations from, and the limits on how much can be spent at elections. The rules on donations are designed to prevent foreign money being given to political parties or being used for election and referendum campaigning. So donations can only be made by permissible donors, and these are registered voters in the UK, including overseas voters who are UK Electoral Register registered, or UK-based organisations such as companies or trade unions. And spending limits are designed to create a level playing field so that no one candidate or party can significantly outspend another during an election and therefore be seen to have potentially bought an election. So are the rules working? Well, we've been recommending since 2013 that changes to these rules are needed for two key reasons. First, to protect public trust, and second, to prevent the risk of foreign money entering UK politics. Perceptions of financial transparency have actually experienced a long-term decline, and I will pop a link to our research on this in the chat at the end. In particular, there's been a marked decrease in those people that agree that party spending and funding is transparent. So it is now down to 15% compared to 25% in 2016. And there's also been a decline in those who agree that they could find out how a party is funded. That's down to 20% compared to 40% in 2016. The Commission also thinks that there remain potential loopholes for impermissible money to enter the system, including from foreign sources. When the current political finance laws were introduced 25 years ago, Parliament explicitly intended to ban foreign donations to UK political parties. We take all possible steps within the current regulatory framework to prevent unlawful foreign money entering UK politics. However, limitations to those laws mean that it does remain possible for money from foreign sources to enter the UK system. For example, a UK registered company is permitted to make donations using money raised overseas, even if the UK company has not generated sufficient funds to support that donation. So this could mean that foreign actors could legitimately use a UK company as a conduit to channel money into our UK political system. Another example is unincorporated associations, who could also legitimately make donations using funding from otherwise impermissible sources, including from overseas. Unincorporated associations are currently not required to ensure that those who donate to them are permissible donors. So how can we improve the system? There are some changes that we're recommending to strengthen and simplify the system and increase transparency for voters. And there are three key recommendations I'd like to mention briefly. The first is that we would like to see parties being legally required to conduct know your donor checks on donations so that they can assess and manage their risks and be confident themselves that the source of their funding is permissible. The second is to prevent companies from donating more than they have made in the UK. And the third is to ensure that those who donate to unincorporated associations are permissible donors. So we're currently discussing these with the government around how the law could be updated to ensure it increases transparency and strengthens controls around donations, as well as simplifying and strengthening enforcement. It's really, really important that any changes that are introduced are workable, effective, proportionate, don't have unintended consequences, and don't restrict legitimate political activity. Finally, what's next for us at the Commission? So alongside our recommendations to government, we're doing all we can to make sure the system as it stands is as transparent as it can be and maintains confidence. We're currently in the process of publishing key financial data from last July's general election so that voters can see what was spent on campaigning. We've published donations for those parties and campaigners who spent less than £250,000. We've recently published the returns of the 4,515 candidates who stood last July, and we'll continue to publish the rest of the 2024 general election spend over the coming months. Our regulatory support team is also looking ahead to the May polls in England, supporting campaigners to comply with the political finance laws that we're discussing today. We're also working with stakeholders, including electoral administrators, parties, campaigners, and other regulators and academics, to continuously review and monitor how the system is working to ensure that our own systems are as up to date and we're as ahead as we possibly can be of issues and problems. And we have a new corporate plan which comes into effect on the 1st of April with a central focus on safeguarding and protecting the system and hopefully leading an informed debate about the future of elections. So discussions like today's are timely and extremely helpful and important. I think I will stop there, Alan. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Jackie. Thank you so much. Really strong foundations for our conversation. Straight over now to Jess.
Thanks very much, and thank you so much for the invite to join you today. I wanted to look at this question through a slightly broader lens of what sort of funding regime really would impact on our democracy in a positive way. And Jackie's mentioned some really important changes there to close loopholes that have been in existence for quite a while. The issue of shell companies potentially being used to funnel money from overseas was a concern of the CSPL before PEPERA came into effect. So these are really important but long-standing issues. And I think they are clear priorities when we look at this issue through the security lens. You know, what could we do to prevent those impermissible donations happening? But I think we could also look at this issue through a broader lens and say, well, what sort of regime would be supportive to democracy? What sort of funding regulations could encourage greater public trust and confidence, could improve participation? And that's the lens that I'd like to apply today. And I think if we're looking through that lens, then we would absolutely be starting with this big donor culture, big money culture that's come to dominate in politics. And that would cause us to look at donations that are permissible, but are actually potentially damaging in different ways. And as Jackie mentioned there, the Electoral Commission look at the statistics around trust in the transparency of the regime. And that has been in long-term decline. And that's quite difficult to reconcile with the fact that actually we have one of the most transparent regimes. It's world leading, in fact, the Electoral Commission's database in that respect. So why are the public not confident? And I think the answer is really around the issue that we've come to increasingly rely, or parties have come to increasingly rely on, a small number of very wealthy donors. And so I think you've got that really highly permissive donations environment where there aren't any caps on the amount that you can donate, and quite broad range of entities, individuals, companies who can donate. And then you add into that the transparency, which is of course important in and of itself for kind of reducing the corruption risk. But when you've got those broad transparency, very permissive donations regime, what you're basically saying to the public is, look, here are the 20 or so millionaires who are funding our politics. And I think understandably, the public are concerned about that. What do people want for their money, essentially? And we do know that a sizable majority of the public think that people donate for their own interests, not because they support a particular party. Now, that's not necessarily the case, but that's the way that the public see it. And of course, when you've got such a large kind of dependency on those small number of very wealthy donors, you know, that adds to public concern. So I think if we took this broader lens of, you know, what would a more democratic funding regime be? You know, how can we foster a democracy where everyone feels their voice matters, not just, you know, the big spenders? Then I think we would definitely be looking at a donations cap. And of course, lots of countries do this. You know, in some cases, the donations cap is really quite low. In France, it's something like €7,500, which wouldn't even meet the threshold for disclosure in the UK's regime. In Canada, it's even lower than that. And there's lots of ways that countries have kind of linked the donation caps in different ways. So some countries link it to minimum wage. So you can't give more than X times the minimum wage in that country, or linked to a party's annual budget. No, not giving more than a percentage of the party's annual budget, which of course prevents parties being captured by singular interests. And sometimes it's linked to campaign spending limits. And of course, we know lots of countries also ban corporate donations. So there's lots of different ways of doing this, and it is really quite common around the world. Now, of course, you're going to say to me, well, that's, reducing the money in is going to have a really big impact on parties. And of course it would do, particularly as parties have come to increasingly rely on a smaller number of very wealthy donors. And of course, because of that, also the amount of money in is going up and up and up. But there are ways of mitigating the impact. We could, of course, look at reducing the spend again. If you haven't got an arms race to meet, then there's less pressure on the donations. And of course, I think we have to be looking again at public subsidy or public funding, which is a really difficult conversation to have, but I think a really, really important one. And there are ways of doing public funding which are slightly more democratic, put more power in the hands of voters, like voter vouchers and schemes like that. And of course, the public at the moment in the UK, we have very, very low levels of public financing, particularly compared to other countries. So I think this is something we need to look at. I think it's good for politicians in the long run because it leaves them less exposed to taking dodgy donations and putting themselves in less risky situations. And of course, at the end of the day, corruption is far more costly to the public purse. So I think that is a really important conversation, a difficult conversation, but one that I think we need to be having. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jess. Lots of interesting ideas for us to follow up on there. Straight over to Mark next.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you to you and the team for putting on what has already been a very interesting discussion. I will try and keep the level of interests going. I thought it might be useful to take a slightly different sort of angle on this and think particularly around transparency, because I think there are two real values to transparency when it comes to party funding and indeed politician funding more generally. One is the sort of democratic principle about knowing who is funding what in our politics. But the other is a more practical one, that the more transparency there is, the better data we have about how our system is working or not working. And actually, therefore, the better any regulation or legislation can be. And I think my big concern in this area is that although we have a superficially fairly rigorous set of transparency rules, as Jackie very clearly set out, for a variety of reasons, there are an awful lot of gaps in them. And perhaps the most important gap is the use of thresholds. Now, the thresholds are an absolutely vital necessity that, if there was the same full regulatory framework every time I spent £1 buying a strip of raffle tickets at a Lib Dem event, as there would be for, say, an individual donating £500,000 to a company, that would rapidly become, completely impractical to administer. So the thresholds that we have about, below which certain sums of money essentially don't even count as a donation, and also the way we have certain thresholds below which, for example, local branches of political parties don't need to have their accounts audited or published, have very strong, very compelling practical reasons behind them. But the cumulative effect of these thresholds, and also some other issues that I'll come on to in a moment, is that we very easily slip into a world where we look at the very good, diligent reports that, say, the Electoral Commission puts out once a quarter summarising declared donations, and slip into talking about those as donations to parties, as if that is somehow the overall donation picture, rather than the donations that happen to be above declarable limit, that happen to be to the bits of the political party that are covered by those quarterly reports. And I'm sure I'm guilty of having slipped into that slightly wider language as well myself at times. So I'm not sort of pointing fingers at anyone at all, but I think it is problematic because we tend to misdescribe our level of knowledge about finance in the system. It's also problematic because obviously I know Justin would never fall prey to this, but some of Justin's colleagues are researchers. If you've got a data set with a spreadsheet, it is so tempting to analyze that. And you may remember to put a couple of caveats in the first paragraph of your academic journal article about how the database doesn't quite cover everything. But it is so unbelievably tempting to act as if the spreadsheet is reflecting reality rather than a very partial, narrow slice of reality. And all of what I've said applies in a world in which there is nobody with any nefarious motivations at all. Obviously, if you have some nefarious motivations, then one can make all the more out of some of the gaps that we have. So I'll just give you one example. And to be fair to the Electoral Commission, I've not yet looked in detail at the figures you published a couple of days ago, but I think Jackie and her colleagues have actually made an important step forward on this one. But it is absolutely legal, above board, the explicit purpose of how electoral and financial legislation is written, that at election time, you can choose to donate directly to a candidate. And that donation then appears on the candidate's constituency expense return. It doesn't appear anywhere in all of those other panoply of reports and data sets that you can donate money directly to a candidate. It appears on their constituency expense return, and at least until a couple of days ago, the situation at each election would be nobody would total up those numbers across all of the different constituency expense returns. Some of those donations, if they're above a relevant threshold and were to a candidate who then became an MP, would be declared on the MP's register of interest. Although, again, no rigorous cross-checking of MP's register of interest against constituency expense returns to make sure that no MP is inadvertently or advertently omitting to declare that. And a fair chunk of those donations to candidates are donations from political parties. The political party gives their candidate a chunk of money, and so is in a sense recycling money that is captured elsewhere in the recording system, but a chunk as well isn't. And until a forthcoming academic article by Chris Butler and myself, hopefully we will manage to fend off the reviewer's comments when we revise it this week. There's not really been any systematic analysis of, even if one were to total the amount of money on those candidate expense returns, how much of it is recycled money that is already in the figures that we might know from elsewhere, and how much of it is genuine extra money. So I think our overall level of knowledge of how much money there is and how much transparency there is and where the money comes from is a lot less than I think people often realize. And as I say, I emphasize that's all without any nefariousness, any wishing to sort of, push the rules, whatever. Of course, in reality, one shouldn't be naive about how everyone behaves, and there are some additional issues there, which is where we get into the points that Jackie and Jess made about how important it is to know more about, say, the original source of money. The second point I just wanted to make, and I'll make it very, very briefly, but is I think running through all of this, we need to have a better framework for understanding how we want money to be used in politics, because it is very easy, for very understandable reasons, to slip into viewing basically money as an evil to be kept at bay as far as possible. And when you look at the misuse and financial corruption or political misdeeds that have been associated with money in politics, very easy to understand why that's an outlook. But there's an awful lot that's very good in politics that requires money. If you want candidates to engage with voters, that requires money to do things like pay for leaflets. There is a lot of good that is and necessary elements of democracy that do require money. And I think the risk with always viewing money as it were an evil to try to minimize is we don't do enough to think about what are the ways of money being used in politics that we want to positively encourage. So I'll just give one final example on that, is that I think we would all, for various, variety of reasons, say that a world in which parties were more dependent on small donors and less dependent on large donors is probably a more healthy democracy, less risk of abuse of power, more people being involved in the system. But there is very little in the system at the moment that incentivizes small donor fundraising ahead of large donor fundraising. Indeed, in some ways, because if the small donation is nonetheless large enough to hit various thresholds, the admin burden of checking small donations is significantly greater than getting one big donation from somebody. So we have a set of almost perverse incentives. And I know previously good work has been done by many thinking about ideas like using gift aid to incentivize small donors to help create that culture. But that would be my sort of two contributions on the topic. One is I think we need to get much better at transparency that really reflects the overall picture of money in the political system. And secondly, we need between us all to generate more ideas about how best to encourage the good use of money in politics, because there is some good use of money in politics, and to incentivize that rather than the more dangerous uses of money.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark. A very on-brand appeal for better data, which is just what we expect from you, but lots of other important things there as well. So thank you. And finally, Justin.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks for the kind invitation today. So the question we were posed was whether or not the party funding regulations were fit for purpose. And I think as a general rule, the answer to that question is yes. And I think there is a lot to celebrate in terms of what we've achieved. Jackie mentioned that the Act which put our regulations in place was 25 years ago this year. And in many respects, PAPIR has been largely successful because it's embedded a number of things in the way we regulate politics. It's embedded transparency. There was none before the Act. It's embedded restrictions on who can make donations. There was no such restriction beforehand. It's embedded spending caps at national level. Previously, it was only at constituency level. And it's established a commission to oversee the whole thing. Previously, the regulation of elections in the United Kingdom was carried out on a rather ad hoc basis by the Home Office. And here, I think Jackie rather undersells the role of the Commission, because all the research on those who are regulated by them is very positive in terms of the role that the Commission plays, not only in providing information, but also in providing guidance to ensure that there aren't inadvertent breaches. And that's important because a number of people, particularly at the constituency level, are volunteers who make themselves liable for any breach. So I think the work of the Commission has been really, really important. And I think it's important to stress that there will always be things that we want to reform. No set of regulations is perfect, and there are always things we can point to. But I want to highlight three where I think we need to think about things moving forward. The first is something that's been touched upon in terms of what we might call foreign money. And the issue that we've had, and it's nicely highlighted by Jackie and Jess, is that in effect, we've approached corporate donations in a sort of good chaps approach, as many people do in terms of the Constitution. In other words, there's been a sort of tacit agreement that people will behave by the rules. And the example that Alan mentioned at the beginning of this webinar suggests that that's very vulnerable if people decide not to play by the unwritten rules. And so I think we can do one of four things. We could do nothing, right? Because the problem as it stands is a threat more than one of actuality. We could take the view that the Electoral Commission takes and make sure that donations can only be made from profits generated in the United Kingdom. We could, as Jess suggests, invoke caps, or we could ban corporate donations altogether. As long as you have corporate donations, there is always a risk that foreign money will come into UK politics. But if you cap or ban these, it raises two issues that require consideration. Firstly, it would have to apply to trade unions as well, and that's proved to be problematic in previous calls for reform. And secondly, you would have to plug the funding gap. So donations over the entire period that we've known about them from companies account for around 17% of all party income. Indeed, in the last Parliament, it was up to 19%. So there are not insignificant sources of income which would have to come from somewhere else. The second area is related to foreign donations, and it's but is still legal, and that is donations made by residents who are citizens who are resident overseas. Now, people who are resident overseas have been able to make donations quite legally if they are on the electoral roll since, in terms of PAPIR, ever since PAPIR came in, there was a 15-year rule. The Elections Act removed that 15-year qualification. And in tandem with this, we've seen a significant growth in the number of people registered to vote overseas, who can therefore make donations. Now, that's perfectly legal, but there is a potential problem waiting to happen if you have large numbers of people resident outside the United Kingdom for some period of time who are funding our parties. And the truth is, we simply don't know how much that is, because at present there is no transparency around any donation coming in from a voter who is resident overseas. And this seems to me to be a problem. We should anticipate these things, which is what the Electoral Commission has sought to do since 2013 on corporate donations. But there needs to be, I think, greater transparency around how much money is coming in from people who are based outside the UK. That would seem to me to be a very easy and very quick win in the spirit of of PAPIRA, of transparency. The third relates to spending limits. So before the last election, the then Secretary of State introduced a raise in the spending limits, bringing them in line with inflation. That was entirely the right thing to do, because the spending limits had not been adjusted since the introduction of PAPIRA. The problem was that it represented a massive step change in how much parties could spend, going up by some 45% in one go. Now, I think the government of the time was right to introduce this increase, but I think we need to guard against the risk of a step change in future, because I think that's likely to advantage some parties and disadvantage others. So I think it would be sensible to have some kind of review every 3 or 5 years to ensure that the limits reflect the real price of politics, and avoid, as I say, the step change that came in advance of the last election.
Great, thank you, Justin. We have a diversity of views in the panel, which is always nice to see. So it'll be interesting to explore these various matters. We've had some questions from the audience in already, which is great. Many thanks for those. If you'd like to ask a question now, it's the perfect time. You've heard the initial contributions from all of the speakers, so do please post your questions in the Q&A function. Just while you're thinking about that, let me start off by going to each of the speakers in turn and really asking you initially to respond to what others have said. Going to Jackie first. I mean, feel free, of course, to respond to anything, but I guess I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on transparency and how to maximize transparency within the system. So there were various ideas that were mentioned there in the course of the discussion. And another point that I think hasn't been made, but that is often raised, is the time that it takes to publish information and whether that could be speedier. So yeah, your thoughts, Jackie, on transparency and anything else that you've heard.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. That's been really, really fascinating, and I'm quite sure I'm going to be lying awake tonight mulling over a lot of those. So thank you, fellow panelists. I completely agree, as you would expect, on the importance of transparency, and we take it, I don't want to overstate this, but we take this as a sort of central, almost sacred sort of responsibility that we have to do all we can to ensure that electors know as much as possible where the money is coming from and what it is being spent on, but in a way that is achievable and feasible for parties. And bearing in mind, I'm thinking about the great diversity of size that we have across our political parties in the UK. So we've got over 400 registered political parties now. We run the register of political parties, and some of them are extremely, well established, efficient, machines, for want of a better way of putting it, with great processes in place, and others are very small, starting out very local or focused on particular issues. And I suppose we need to try and make sure that any rules that are implemented or any obligations that are implemented don't put excessive barriers to participation on those smaller parties. Just a first thought. So there is something around proportionality and not making the playing field impossible for new or smaller parties to enter because of complexity or administrative burden. And a second thought was just thank you, Justin, for what you said about us potentially underselling ourselves. And I think Mark noted that we had made some changes in the last couple of weeks, which we've worked very hard on, Mark. So thank you for noticing on how much information we can report on candidate spending returns. So if you wouldn't mind, I could just take a second to explain how that currently works. At the moment, the candidates who stood for general election last year, they report their spending returns to their local returning officer with all the kind of evidence that they can provide. We collect that from the returning officers. It's usually quite an iterative process, and then we publish it. And we have tried to improve both the amount of data that we publish and also the searchability of that with a new search tool. And so I will pop that in the chat as well, so people can have a look for themselves. But I suppose it is just that constant strive to make the information that we can currently collect more accessible and make it more efficient, and not to place too much of that burden on often volunteers and grassroots participation. So very much anything that we can do within the powers that we've currently got, but also within changes that are achievable to increase transparency. We are completely up for considering those. And on the timing point, Alan, yes, it does take a long time. We're trying to, we are often going backwards and forwards with parties and non-party campaigners to make sure that they understand what it is that's required. Sometimes it's not always clear to them, particularly if they're new, and we have to then make sure that it's accurate. So we do a lot of completeness and accuracy checking, so that we're not publishing something that's not correct, which would be misleading in a different way.
So does that mean you think that it wouldn't be a good idea to try to go faster?
I think we are always trying to find ways, and I don't want to start talking about IT systems because that will make everybody turn off or shudder. But we are trying, and I'm leading a piece of work in the Commission on this at the moment to improve the systems that we use, which will hopefully, and I'm also slightly apprehensive about committing to that, will also reduce the burden on the people that we're collecting that information from, so that we could. But at the moment, our aim is to publish complete and accurate data as soon as we possibly can, and that's what PREPARA requires us to do as soon as practically possible, I think is the wording.
Great, thank you. That's very clear. Jess, again, do feel free to respond to anything. I guess I was particularly interested in at least a difference of emphasis between you and Justin in looking at a potential donation cap. So you talked about potentially some ways in which the shortfall in funding to political parties might be addressed either by reducing the spending limits so that parties don't need so much money, or by introducing greater public funding of political parties. And I think Justin was certainly suggesting that the first of those would not be a good idea, and I think was perhaps, oh, well, no?
Not that it wouldn't be a good idea, but there may be unforeseen consequences.
Okay.
That need to be thought through.
Okay. And similarly, you were suggesting that there could be unforeseen consequences of greater public funding for political parties, and that again would need to be thought through. Whereas, Jess, I think you were suggesting that these things could be done and might be desirable. So do you want to flesh out your thinking on that a bit?
Sure, and I think there's lots of different ways of going about it. And when the CSPL looked at this, they were suggested a range of different ways, but potentially saw it as more of a bridging. So if we, as Mark said, if we were going towards a smaller, more diverse sort of funding regime, then do you look at public funding to sort of help parties transition into that? or do we think that that doesn't necessarily exist and it needs to be more of a permanent thing? And there's also a bit of a difference in sort of looking at comparative examples of the countries who just do direct public subsidy. So it's like a cost per vote kind of arrangement, or countries who go for something that's a little bit more indirect. So I think Mark mentioned the sort of tax relief on donations. Some people do match funding donations. There's certain schemes where voters can go along and have their sort of voter dollar, as it were, and say, well, I want to give my pound to this party. It doesn't have to be the same party that you voted for. But lots of schemes as well, of course, of sort of indirect subsidies, which we have in this country already in terms of free advertising. And of course, we do have some direct grants as well. And Mark there mentioned about, what do we want money in politics to be for? Well, if you're looking at public subsidies, sorry, the lights board of what I'm saying, I hope you're not. When you're looking at public subsidies, you can then direct the activity that it's used for. So we have a bit of that already in the policy development grants. So you do have a bit more ability to direct what parties use the money for with public subsidy. So there's lots of different ways of doing it. And I do absolutely hear what Justin's saying about that there is a shortfall if you suddenly strip away the big donations, but it does also present an opportunity to go, okay, well, what do we want money in politics to be for, and how can we do that in a way that's more democratic?
Right, thank you. Mark, you're both kind of committed to the principle of democratic equality, but you're also the president of a political party that could do with lots of money to fund its activities. How do you see this issue around donation caps and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think,
I didn't want to
as
send her a
Justin
message
touched on, part of the issue is how much a political party is able to spend, and what do they spend it on. And in that sense, I think Justin's absolutely right that introduction of national expense limits, that was a major achievement of PPERA. But across the various limits on party and candidate spending, there are a lot of gaps. So actually, one way of taking a whole chunk of money out of politics is, in a way, nothing to do with the income side, but it would be one tiny little edit to PPERA, which would be to remove the exemption for national staff costs from the national expense limit. So at the moment, we have a system that essentially incentivizes parties to have large staff operations, because a whole load of those costs are exempt from the national expense limit, whilst the large volunteer operation, the support and running costs of that wouldn't be exempt in the same way. Obviously, it also therefore tends to benefit larger parties rather than smaller parties, which, depending on one's view about whether political systems are better with more or fewer parties, one may take a view, one way or the other on. You won't get. I'm sure you'll be able to guess what my view is on that. But I think there are some things on the expenditure side which definitely could significantly help. I think the other thing around donor caps is clearly a good idea, and I would say the right thing. But this also partly, I think, comes back to my earlier point about transparency, which is, I think it's fair to say that most of the numbers that people have picked, including my own party, for this is what we think a donor cap should be, are sort of enlightened guesswork. We don't have the sort of financial modelling and forecasting behind those calculations in a way that we're used to when also, as indeed we're seeing this week with the spring non-budget set of financial announcements from the Chancellor, huge amounts of modelling. And so I think this gets back to the importance of transparency, because we need better information to understand what the real impact of different policies might be. But certainly I think donor caps have a major sort of levelling advantage in that I think there is an important right of sort of freedom for people to want to take part in the political system, and in some cases for people that is about giving money rather than being able to give time. But there is obviously a huge inequity and a huge risk of imbalance in political power that can result from having no caps at all. Well, not just does result from having no caps at all.
Thank you. Justin, I suspect there's much there that you'd like to respond to.
Well, mainly to say that I don't actually disagree with Jess and Mark as much as one might think. I mean, in the past, I've worked on studies by the CSPL where caps have been promoted. I think what I would say is that the lesson we learned from that is if you are going to introduce caps, and Mark is quite right, the levels at which you introduce them, like all thresholds, are essentially arbitrary as things stand, then there is in reality no alternative but to increase public subsidies. So the idea of there being an untapped army of small donors out there is frankly for the birds. There is no donor culture, small donor culture in this country, and we can see that by the way in which our universities are funded. If you compare us with the United States, where you have large numbers of people contributing through alumni donations, that culture just does not exist here. And so I think, if we were to take Jess's suggestions, which, with which I'm, sympathetic, I think there are two things to think about. One, if you cut off an important source of income, you have to make it up from somewhere else. Realistically, that's the public subsidy. And two, the issue that has derailed talk of caps in the past has been not how it would affect individual donations and corporate donations, but how it would affect the relationship between trade unions and the Labour Party. Now, personally, I don't think that's insurmountable, but that would need commitment from the Labour Party to effectively change its position. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. The other thing that I would stress, however, and where I do disagree with some of the speakers, is the tying in of expenditure caps on elections to how much money needs to be raised. Now, for sure, election years are where parties raise and spend most money. But in fact, most money generated by political parties is on routine business. It's on existing as a political party. It's not on spending lots and lots of money in general election years. It's on paying for the photocopier and paying for the staff. And I think that's a really important thing that we mustn't lose sight of. Parties need money. Like Jess, I would want to avoid a situation where there were small numbers of wealthy donors making a disproportionate contribution. But if we accept that they need money, and we also accept that actually spending in campaigns is a good thing because it boosts turnout, then I think we have to either restrict things to make sure there's no foreign money in a sort of minimalist way, or we need to accept that the money will need to come from somewhere else. And I think that's a big question. When we did the last inquiry with the CSPL, the cost was calculated at 50 pence per voter per year, which is not an excessive amount to deal with what was then a proposed cap of £10,000 on any donation. There is another question which we could perhaps take from Canada or approach, which was to say that institutions don't have the vote, so therefore they should be precluded from making donations. That's a bigger step, but it's one I think that should be considered.
And those are numbers from the 2011 Committee on Standards of Public Life report. So yeah, a little bit out of date perhaps now, but yeah. Okay, great, thank you. No, sorry, I'm not criticising. I'm just thinking about how they might transfer across to today. I have many more questions that I would like to ask, but lots of you have been asking questions as well, putting them in the Q&A. So let's bring Tom back on screen now and see what questions he'd like to take from those that have been submitted. And then maybe if I'm lucky, I'll have a chance to ask a few more questions myself later on. But Tom, what do you have for us?
All right, thank you, Alan. So in this first group, we've got 3 questions. The first 2 are about the public's role, and the third of which is about transparency. So firstly, there's a question from Prava Petkar, who particularly directs the challenge to Jackie and asks, is there data available around how much the public engage with the reports published by the Electoral Commission? And they wonder if a challenge here is not just publishing the data, but ensuring full public awareness of that data and how it might be done. An anonymous questioner then they particularly directed this to Jess, and they ask, is Jess in favour of public funding of campaigning? But then they ask a sort of a broader question, which is there any data on public attitudes towards introducing public funding of political parties? And then the third question is about transparency, and is appropriate enough from another anonymous questioner. And they say that many of New Labour's constitutional reforms, including requiring the Electoral Commission to report donations, seem to have been motivated by the assumption that transparency would improve public faith in democracy. But public confidence in politics, politicians, and the political finance regime has been in long-term decline. So could it be that the more the public find out about how things work, the less they like them?
Great questions. Very good. Jackie, do you want to start off with the first of those on the public engagement with the data?
Yes, I don't have
the reports, I should say.
Yes, I don't have to hand data on downloads for our reports. I do know that we get a lot of questions about them, and we do have a lot of engagement. What we also though try and do, and I have put Alan in the chat, link to our most recent research on public attitudes, which is where those figures around that declining trend in people feeling that there is transparency and that they have confidence in political finance spending come from. And we're concerned about that, which is why we're pleased to see this issue highlighted. It is an interesting question, that final one that Tom read out, around whether knowing more has the opposite effect. I will take that to my research colleagues and see whether that's a question that we can set. But as things stand, our aim is to publish as much as we possibly can in as accessible and understandable way that we can. I think there's also something perhaps that we can all do a little bit more on, which is around the I think it might have been Justin's point in his earlier remarks about the things that parties are spending this money on they are not necessarily bad or nefarious things. They are the things that enable parties to understand what their local issues are, engage with their communities, and develop policies that they feel can address and reflect those. And when you look in the returns details that we've been able to publish, you can see those categories, advertising and get public engagement, reflected very clearly. So there is something which we are committed to, which is very much around showing the reality of what that money is going on, to hopefully allay concerns that it's being misused in some way.
Thank you. Jess, you also had a question particularly directed at you on what you actually think about public funding, and also what the public think. And of course, feel free to address the others too if you want.
Yes, well, ERS supports some public subsidy. For all the reasons I outlined, that this does feel like a necessary way of making the whole system less reliant on the big donors and creating a level playing field, and we've discussed that quite a bit in the chat with some of the trade-offs there. Public understanding of our system is pretty low, as you might imagine. And when it comes to how people see the funding regime, is quite interesting in the sense that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what's government and what's party politics. Lots of misunderstandings about how much public subsidy there is already. People think it's a lot higher than it actually is. So there's some interesting findings there. But it won't surprise people to know that obviously perceived corruption, or people's sense of things being dodgy, is really high as well. So I wouldn't need to run a poll today to know that probably if you just did straight up, do you want to spend some more money on politicians, the answer is going to be no, thank you very much. But when we've done stuff in the past where we've given people the trade-offs, when we've had more kind of a round conversation about what the pros and cons are and what the alternatives might be, then you find that support goes straight up, because people do not want politics in the hands of wealthy donors. So I think it's a mixed picture on the public understanding, but I would, from the starting point, there's a big piece of education to do on where the money is at the moment in the first place.
Great, thank you. Do you want to add anything on the transparency question? It's a rather intriguing question about whether transparency actually sometimes has the opposite of the intended effect on public confidence.
Yeah, and this is the concern. Obviously, it's got an important role to play in preventing creating an environment that's not conducive to corruption in the first place. But of course, when you show people behind the curtain, that can have the opposite effect. But actually, over the long term, reduces corrupt activities. People get used to it, and in the long term, of course, it can improve trust. But you have to have lots of other things working at the same time. So transparency in and of itself is not enough.
Mark and Justin, you didn't have a question specifically directed at you, but are there any points that you want to add there? Mark first.
Yeah, just on that transparency point, I mean, it reminds me a little bit of the question around MPs' expenses and then the increased transparency around MPs' expenses, which I think was definitely the right thing to do, but hasn't, or at least there is very minimal evidence that it has helped restore trust in MPs. That doesn't mean that it's the wrong thing to do, because transparency, is right in principle. But also, I think what transparency is much more effective at doing is not rebuilding trust with the public, but preventing or minimizing the number of future crises that further damage trust. And so I think we've seen that with MPs' expenses, that while greater transparency hasn't really restored the reputation of MPs, it has helped avoid further crises that would have further damaged that. And obviously, one can never be quite sure about that hypothetical, but there's a whole set of behaviours that are now very much in the past because of that increased transparency. And I think we see that a little bit with party donations at the moment. If you think about some of the controversies in recent times around who a particular donor to a political party is, I can see where the questioner is coming from, that you think, well, actually, had that donor name be completely secret and therefore none of those stories happened, perhaps there would have been, perhaps trust would be higher, that transparency is maybe in a sense damaging it. But I think knowing that the names of your donors become public does also help avoid some of the egregious abuses that, if you go back to the pre-Papira era, were definitely present. So I would view it as the right thing to do and a necessary thing to do, but not as a solution to trust.
Justin?
Or rather, solution to rebuilding trust.
I mean, broadly, I agree with Mark. I think the point about transparency is that the data that transparency generates can be used well, or it can be used poorly. And the poor use of those data is often at the heart of the problem. So newspaper stories making spurious links because two things are ostensibly connected. Mark is right that what transparency does is it tends to promote self-denying behavior. But it also points to the fact that transparency on its own is not enough. So one route that one could take is to say that, listen, we can't regulate things like foreign donations. We can't regulate all of these other areas because the loopholes are too large. So let's just rely on transparency. And actually what this reveals, and the questioner is absolutely right that it's gone down, that transparency on its own is insufficient. It does need the support of the other regulations that we have.
Great, thank you. Tom, do you have a second round for us?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Alan. So the first question comes from John Cartledge and is about whether having a donation cap could be circumvented either by an individual splitting their donation as coming from various friends and or relatives, or by them making numerous smaller donations to each of a party's individual candidates. Then an anonymous questioner highlights that political campaigning has changed a lot in the time since Papera was introduced in 2000, and so they ask, have the rules kept pace with modern campaigning, and particularly online campaigning, and if not, how might they be updated? And then finally, Peter Martin notes that political parties are very powerful in our constitution and that they have big consequences for democracy and our national life, and so asks, should we be regulating what political parties are, how they are formed, run, and for what purpose, and on whose behalf? And Peter suggests that this would be more similar to how charities are regulated at the moment.
Wow, I'm loving these questions. Fantastic stuff. Shall we go in reverse order this time? So Justin, do you want to?
Yeah, so could a donation cap be circumvented? It could happen, but it would be illegal. So, one has to work on the basis that lots of things could happen, but it would be in the same way that you have to report donations over the threshold, even if you make more than if you make ones that are under the threshold over the year, that would need to be reported. So I think we'd have to rest on legality there. Political campaigning has changed a lot, and the Elections Act finally caught up with this in terms of digital imprints. But actually, campaigning hasn't perhaps changed as much as people think. The biggest spend for all parties is on print rather than digital. That's not to say that we don't need to be minded of the digital, but it's also worth pointing out that even with the various forms of campaigning that have evolved, the most effective in terms of electoral success is contact by individuals. So someone knocking on your door. And should we regulate parties more, say what they should be? I would be opposed to that fundamentally, because I think parties are voluntary associations and can evolve in a variety of ways, but I think there are reasonable standards, standardization that we can impose in terms of their financial affairs.
The questioner there, Peter, was suggesting an analogy with charities and whether parties are currently regulated less than charities and whether it would be desirable to bring them up to that level. Is that an accurate analogy? Is it a helpful analogy?
I must say my knowledge of charities law is perhaps not what it ought to be. I think it's a reasonable analogy to draw because they're voluntary organizations. But what you do when you introduce regulation is you have to have compliance on the other side. And I think it would be regrettable if we over-regulated parties and didn't permit people to engage in straightforward voluntary campaigning, certainly at constituency level. I think it's a reasonable question, but I'd need to know more about charities before I could answer with any certainty.
Very good. Mark.
Yeah, so I agree mostly with what Justin said, although I'm maybe a little bit less sanguine about how the aggregation rules do and don't work at the moment. And I think, if you look at the evolution of the Electoral Commission's advice and guidance on aggregation over the last, 25 years now, I think that shows that actually that is quite a difficult area. That said, as Justin says, abusing it on a significant enough scale to undermine the purpose of the cap in the first place is definitely something that I'm sure could be caught. On the campaigning, I guess as Justin says, although campaigning has in some ways changed, in many ways it's very much not changed in the last 25 years, and canvassing and leaflets through the letterboxes are still the sort of the core of what makes for effective campaigning. In that sense, the thing that has changed that probably matters the most is not so much the stuff involving technology, but the way that so many people now live in flats behind concierges and the like, and without, for example, even necessarily a shared letterbox. And so in that sense, and I say this only partly tongue-in-cheek, actually, regulations around provision of and access to letterboxes would probably be a more important move to reflect the changes in wider society over the last couple of decades. On the regulation point, I think fundamentally, I'm not clear what it is that parties do that is wrong or undesirable that regulating them more like charities would stop. So unfortunately, if this was an in-person meeting, I would now be asking the questioner, what's your example? And I do think there's an important point that the fundamental belief as to what is the right structure for a political party varies much more depending on your political ideology than it does if you ask that same range of people how do they think a company or a charity should be structured. So if you take the very big difference between the way, say, my party is structured or the Reform Party is structured, those are massively different, and I can't really see a charity type regulatory structure that could encompass both of them. But I think both of those different approaches should be legal. I happen to think Reform's one is bad and undesirable for all sorts of politically partisan reasons, doubtless somebody from Reform on this call would say the same about my party structure. But I think that's a legitimate and even desirable variation of views in a democracy. I don't think that political parties are similar enough to be amenable to a charity type regulation, but that's pending what the questioner would throw in as their supplementary were we in person.
Peter hasn't yet put a supplementary in the Q&A, but feel free to do so, and we might have time to pick it up. Jess.
Well, I think I would slightly differ on the risk around donation splitting. It is looking at comparative evidence. This is a very common path for avoiding the rules generally in other countries. So I think it is still a risk area. I think the ability to donate money via online sort of crowdfunded sort of things does create a slightly more difficult picture to regulate. So I think that's still something we should be aware of, and I think actually lowering the threshold helps to avoid that sort of, as previous people said, to aggregate enough to make it worthwhile. But also maybe that links also to the know your donor stuff that Jackie was talking about at the beginning, that parties really do have those checks in place that to be sure that these things aren't happening. And I think it's reassuring to know that some of that face-to-face and through the door stuff is still really, really important in campaigning. But we also know that parties are spending a greater and greater amount on online campaigning at each election. So I think that's something where the rules do need to keep pace with what's happening. And of course, there have been issues in the past of sort of very vague invoices, X amount from Facebook, and it's not very clear whether those ads are being targeted at the national level or the constituency level. And of course, there is possibility of the rules around splitting those spends to be evaded that way. So I think just keeping on top of those things, not suggesting that it's a huge new risk, but that it's clearly a place where money's been spent and needs to be needs an eye on it.
Thank you very much. And Jackie.
Thank you. A couple of thoughts in the interest of time, Alan. So in terms of the question about whether the framework has kept pace with changes in society, and I think the answers so far have mostly been on spending, and our data probably bears out what Justin has said in terms of what money is actually spent on. But what we have seen is an evolution of things like crowdfunding being part of how funds are raised. So we're actually this afternoon, we'll be publishing some updated guidance on crowdfunding queries, because this is something that parties have asked us for. So there's a lot of the particularly technological developments. I suppose the rate of increase in their use and their influence, I would say, is a major factor, and it's quite hard for legislation to keep up with that. So we try where we can to provide guidance that will help those parties keep on the right side of their obligations with that. So we're, for example, as an example, issuing crowdfunding guidance for parties and campaigners today. And then just on another point, Alan, on sort of public engagement, public confidence, I guess I should have mentioned that voter engagement will be, voter education will be a key part of our next corporate plan, and that's particularly important with the extension of the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds across the whole of the UK. So that will be an enormously central focus for the Electoral Commission, alongside all of the existing voter information work, really trying to make our whole system understandable in a way that enables those new voters to get off to a positive start with their engagement.
I certainly give a big personal thumbs up to that one. So that's great to hear. We just about have time to squeeze in another round. If Tom, you've got maybe a couple of questions that you can think we can get in.
Absolutely. So we have one from Paul Tyler, who asks, is the panel satisfied with the level of transparency for constituency campaign spending, especially in relation to national party investment at that level? And then we have an appropriate one to finish on from Rose Whiffen, who says, how do we persuade politicians to introduce reforms in this area, especially the donations cap?
Excellent questions. Thank you so much. Where shall we start this time? Jess, we haven't started yet with you. Do you want to go first?
Great. Maybe I'll try and tackle Rose's really important and really tricky questions. I'm sure she and I have both banged our heads against this one a few times. It's really difficult, isn't it? Like, politicians are not going to want to be on the front foot with this one around definitely around public funding and donations caps. But I think we really have to take the wider lens and look at this huge problem of trust in politics. And that's where I'd start from. Because ultimately I don't think we can carry on in this particular vein, but creating the space for those conversations, and wouldn't be totally new. I mean, there were cross-party talks about a decade ago on this issue. They stalled. I'd hope they'd be able to be picked up again. But yeah, I think starting from how the public perceive the funding regime, it has to be the way to persuade politicians to do something about this.
Very good, thank you. And I should mention that Rose is, if I remember correctly, one of the co-authors of the Transparency International report that came out in December that advocated for a tighter spending cap. Well, sorry, it advocated for a donations cap on donations to political parties. Mark, do you want to pick up that one, or Paul? So Paul, of course, is one of your erstwhile colleagues on the Lib Dem benches in the House of Lords, and he also has an important publication in this area, along with Nick Harvey, arguing for the need to look more carefully at the split between constituency campaigning and national campaigning.
Yes, I mean, the problem there essentially is that, again, completely legally, absolutely in line with what the legislation says, what a political party can do is massively concentrate its national election spend in a target seat. And so if you look at the target seats that different parties were piling their resources into in the general election last year, typically for every pound that appeared on the constituency election expense, that political party will have probably, on average across the main party, spent £15 that counted against the national election expense. So the constituency election expense has ended up being a tiny proportion of the total amount of money that gets spent in a constituency that has a full-on campaign, because it's just perceived as a marginal or a target seat. And I think that does mean that there is a big sort of gap in sort of transparency and knowledge. Justin and I have often discussed in the past as well. It makes me dubious about some of the academic work that really relies on the constituency expense figure as being a proxy for how much campaigning really happens, because it is such a small proportion of the overall total. But crucially, what it also does, and as being somebody who is, as it were, at head office at a political party, I can now see the upside of what I'm about to say, is it gives much more power to party HQs. Because if you've got the vast majority of your spend being on the national expense limit, it's also the vast majority is controlled by not the candidate, but by party HQ. And so we've had a big shift in political power because party HQs, obviously in a very democratic and collaborative way, control those purse strings. And that is also coming back to Jackie's point earlier about all of those other parties out there. That is a huge disadvantage, either for, let's say, a disgruntled MP who decides to quit their party, but then doesn't have a national expense limit that they can put all that other money against, if they're then up against a candidate from their now ex-party, and also is a big disadvantage for smaller parties overall, that even though they might be putting up candidates such that they have a national expense limit, they can't raise money. And so I think there's been a big, as it were, presidentialization of our politics and a big shift in control to the centre that is very undesirable. And I think certainly if in, say, 1999, 2000, when Papira was being crafted and going through, if we'd been saying, well, is this what we want to incentivise across parties, people would have said, actually, well, maybe it's the opposite. And so I think there is a problem there, but that gets much more into expenditure rules than it does into the topic for today. So let me stop at that point.
Great, thank you.
And Justin will now
Jackie,
disagree with me.
but I'll have to ask him to be quite quick. So Justin and
Sorry.
Jackie, if you could be quite speedy in your final remarks, that would be great. Justin first.
Well, just on the point that Mark's been talking about, Paul raises a perennial problem when you have two different spending limits, and on balance, the alternatives to the current situation are worse in terms of the potential outcomes. Mark talks about enabling the centre as things stand. If we, for example, merge the spending limits, that would give complete control to the centre. So I think, there is no perfect alternative, but on balance, I think the status quo is probably the least bad option.
Very good. And Jackie.
I guess my final point might then just go back to the one that Rose made, which is that it's very important if new regulations, as and when new regulations are being considered, that they are not just poured into the existing system without consideration of the kind of wider potential implications, both for potentially placing huge burdens on smaller parties, or having upstream or downstream consequences, or driving or changing behavior on how parties then manage their reporting. So we just need to adding new law or regulation without thinking about how it engages with existing regulation might end up not being as helpful as it intended to be. And I guess that would be my final observation on this. Very much keen to streamline and simplify electoral law where we can, rather than just necessarily topping it up.
Very good. Thank you so much. We could keep going for quite a long time. I have so many more questions that I want to burrow down into, but this has been a really fascinating conversation. We have covered a huge amount of time of terrain. We have also gone into lots of detail, and much of it which has been great. So thank you all so much. Just before I properly thank you, let me say that the recording for this seminar will appear on our YouTube channel and podcast feed in the coming days. So please do subscribe to those, or look out for information on Blue Sky. If you're not already signed up to our events mailing list, please do so in order to be the first to hear about our forthcoming events. You can just follow the Get Involved link on the Constitution Unit's website. We haven't yet advertised our next event, but we will be doing so hopefully very soon on the website and the mailing list and on Blue Sky. So with that, let me thank all of you in the audience for attending today, but especially let me thank our fantastic set of speakers, Jackie Killeen, Jess Garland, Mark Pack and Justin Fisher, as well as Tom Fleming for fielding the questions, and Ed Rowe, who has been behind the scenes making sure everything went to plan. So thank you all so much to all of you, and good afternoon. We look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye.